Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll see a lot of first-time faces. We're delighted to have you. This is the Department of History's seminar series, and we invite scholars from other places to come and talk to us about other things every now and then. And it's very happy to see everyone here. Everything has its story, its origin story, and the origin of our speaker's arrival here today began when I was in third grade. My mother was a volunteer at our local library. It was a mobile home on the side of the road, and she would always take me in the afternoons. And so I developed this real love of going to the library every week, and I still do. Every week I go down to the Kingston Frontenac Library, and as I was thinking about this, I'm magnetically drawn to three genres of new books they have. Autobiographies of entertainment figures, biographies of coaches, and what I like to call big fat books about war. And I was there last year and stumbled upon a big fat book about war written by Fredrik Logevall. It's called Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. And I saw that book and I thought, well, it's big, it's fat, it's got pictures. And it's about something I know nothing about, which is the origins of the Vietnam War and the tail end of the French empire in that part of the world. And so I read it wanting to fill in a blank, so to speak, in terms of my own knowledge, but other things jumped out. One was the destruction, without explicitly doing this, of categories. There are no North Vietnamese or South Vietnamese or Americans or French. It's all much more complicated. And so what I thought was a fairly simple imperialistic conflict turned into a much more complicated internecine struggle. But then to take that complexity and distill it into a simple, accessible, sophisticated narrative, I thought was a real feat. And I thought, this is someone I would like to hear talk. So when Andrew, the seminar speaker organizer, series organizer, was putting together the roster, I said, I think that guy down at Cornell ought to be invited up here to come and speak. And we're delighted to have Professor Fredrik Logevall here with us today. He's not a stranger to Canada. He got his BA at Simon Fraser in 1986, PhD at Yale in 1993, and taught at UC Santa Barbara, and began teaching at Cornell in 2004, where he's a professor of history and also vice provost for international affairs. He's published widely in U.S. history, broadly speaking, with books on terror, the Cold War, and Vietnam, of course. His book, Embers of War, that I found in the library a little more than a year ago, it's a great book. It won the Francis Parkman Prize, which is one of the top honors that American historians give to books in the field. Also won the Pulitzer Prize, which means it stands out nationally. I'd also like to thank him not just for speaking today, but also for giving a keynote address. We have, beginning tomorrow, the McGill-Queens conference, which our grad students organize in partnership with McGill, and Professor Logevall has also agreed to give a keynote speech at that conference tomorrow. That'll be at 4:15 in the reception hall of the Agnes Museum, and it'll be called The Uses of History, Political Leaders, and the Past. So thank you, Fredrik, for doing double duty on your visit today. But today's talk is intriguing enough. It's the mystery of the Vietnam War.
Well, I thank you for that introduction. Absolutely wonderful to be with you, and grateful to everybody involved in making this happen. Andrew in particular, it's been so good to coordinate with you and to be back. This is actually my second visit to Kingston in just about 6 or 7 months. My son is applying to college, as we say in the States. And so he wanted to see Queens, so we came. All four of us came this summer. He loved it. He applied. If any of you have friends in the admissions office, I gather it works a little differently in Canada. In the U.S., that actually could make maybe more of a difference. But he's crossing fingers and toes, let's say, about Queens. So I'm going to talk about the Vietnam War. It's exactly 50 years ago. that it began in a serious way for the United States. It became a large-scale war under Lyndon Johnson. I'll talk quite a lot about Johnson today. On March 8th, so it'll be 50 years ago on, what is that, Sunday? The first U.S. ground troops came ashore at Da Nang off the coast of South Vietnam, March 8th, 1965. Just a few days before that, Johnson had opted to commence sustained bombing of North Vietnam and of enemy-held areas in the south. And by the end of 1965, by December of 65, we have 180,000 plus U.S. ground forces in South Vietnam, drawn from small towns, large cities all across the United States. How do we explain the war? In a way, that's the fundamental question that I want to pose today. How do we explain its origins in particular, its long duration, its outcome? And in particular today, I want to focus on America's intervention. If I have some time at the end, I'll also talk a little bit about what should be the takeaway in terms of current foreign policy today. And I want to submit to you as I begin that these are questions of great historical importance. And I'm not sure, I should also admit at the outset, that I can give you the full answer to the questions. In fact, here's a confession. In some respects, I think that the war is harder for me to explain today, 2015, than when I started work on the Vietnam struggle in graduate school 25 years ago. I remember in a graduate seminar, first year of graduate school, saying with breezy confidence that however misguided the American intervention might seem in retrospect, in the context of its own time, it was inevitable. It made perfect sense. So I referred in that seminar, on that day in New Haven, to the Cold War consensus, and which I thought then to be this very powerful thing. I referred to the domino theory and the power of that notion that if South Vietnam fell, if you allow the first domino to fall, all the other little dominoes would then fall soon thereafter. I talked about hubris, this exaggerated self-confidence that I thought, on the basis of my reading as an undergraduate, American officials had. By the way, a very important book, and it's still a very important book, even though I think it gets this a little bit wrong, as I'll say in a moment. David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest. In graduate school, as an undergraduate at SFU, I read Halberstam's book and was blown away. And I credit that book with giving me a desire as an undergraduate to want to pursue the study of U.S. foreign policy as a graduate student, and perhaps beyond, and then making me especially interested in the Vietnam struggle. And a theme in his book is that hubris is very much characterizing American decision-making. So that's how I felt then, but 25 years later, I no longer feel the same way. I see it differently. I will no longer say, this was the word I used in that graduate seminar, and I felt very smart for using it. I said it was over-determined. I thought the professor is going to like the fact that I used that word with confidence, but I no longer see the war as over-determined. And I think in the course of two books in particular, I've written about Vietnam in several different places, but two books in particular. My first book, Choosing War, and then Embers of War. I think on the basis of the research for those books, I've come to a different conclusion. In fact, there's a mystery here at the heart of this story. Not only was the war not overdetermined, I think in some respects it's actually difficult to explain. Even as Johnson opted for that large-scale escalation that I mentioned a while ago, he privately felt growing pessimism about the prospects in the war in early 1965, growing doubts, maybe more interestingly, growing doubts that the outcome really mattered to American security. So here's a quote from March 6th. So this is 50 years ago tomorrow. It's too bad I'm not giving this talk tomorrow. because then it would be precisely 50 years. But he said this: a man can fight if he can see daylight when down the road somewhere. But there ain't no daylight in Vietnam. There's not a bit, unquote. Some months before that, Johnson said to McGeorge Bundy, who was his national security advisor, I don't think it's worth fighting for, that is Vietnam. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. Think about that one for a minute. In Congress, similar fears and misgivings. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Key Allied governments opposed to an expanded war, not thinking that the Americans could win with the South Vietnamese, and not thinking it was really crucial to Western security that they try to win. In the CIA, in the State Department, in the middle levels of the American government, also pessimism about the prospects, even towards the top. Figures like Robert McNamara, who are often considered to be, uber hawks on the war, actually possessed these concerns, these fears, this lack of optimism about what was going to happen. So I'm suggesting to you that the war is hard to explain, that there is a mystery as to why this happened. But of course, explain it we must. We have to try as historians to come to an explanation. And I do think we can reach an explanation for why the United States opted to do what it did. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to proceed in 3 parts, also leaving time for making sure that we leave time for discussion. I want to talk a bit about the early period, in particular the French Indochina War, World War II and the French Indochina War, because part of the answer for why America's war happened is that there was a war fought by the French before the Americans came. And the Americans were very involved in that French war. So I want to talk about that earlier period, especially in terms of what it means for our understanding of the American war. Second, I want to talk about the 3 presidents who are at the heart of the Vietnam experience for the United States: John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. I'll say more about Kennedy and Johnson than Nixon, but we can talk about Nixon if anybody's interested in the discussion. Finally, third and finally, I'll say a few words about what I call the permissive context that allowed the American war to happen. And by permissive context, I'm talking about Congress. I'm talking about the press, the media, shall we say. I'm talking about public opinion. John and Jane Q. Citizen in the United States. And that permissive context, by the way, and I'm not sure, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I'm not sure how much time I'll have to do this, but I think that permissive context also exists, also helps us explain later American interventions. And the prime example for me is the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So I may make a passing reference to the permissive context with respect to Iraq. Now, as you're already sensing, perhaps, and I want to just underscore, there is a US-centric quality to my lecture today. There's, of course, a very important international context here that I've tried to develop, particularly in Embers of War. The Vietnamese, it goes without saying, are key to what happens in their own country. I won't say as much about the Vietnamese today because there's only so much we can do in 40 minutes. I want to keep the focus here on why it is that 50 years ago this war happened. But I do want to just note that at the outset. Let's go back to the early period, and in particular, I think, to the French War. It seems to me that in our rush to get to America's war, scholars, myself very much included, have given short shrift to what went before. It's as though in our work, somehow the Vietnam War just started one day in the early 1960s. And I want to suggest, today that World War II, to begin with, is of monumental importance to everything that will happen later. It occupies a central place, therefore, in Embers of War. And I want to just say here very briefly that World War II, I think, matters in 3 ways in particular. First, the Viet Minh, which is the revolutionary organization led by Ho Chi Minh, that took on and then fought the French. The Viet Minh came out of World War II much stronger than it went in. Much better positioned to fight the French, to try to defeat a French attempt to control Indochina. And I should note here parenthetically, you probably all know this history, but I'll just mention that France was defeated in 6 short weeks by the Germans in 1940. The fall of France. An astonishing and a humiliating defeat for the French. Japan took advantage of that outcome in Europe to swoop into Southeast Asia and to Indochina to take de facto control over Indochina. They were clever in the sense that the Japanese, in that they allowed the French to maintain day-to-day control in Indochina. But everybody knew who had the real power, and that was Japan. So now, with Japan defeated in 1945, France wants to return. The Viet Minh are set to stop them. So the first importance here of World War II for today's purposes is that the Viet Minh came out stronger. Second, the war drastically weakened. World War II drastically weakened the imperial powers in general, and France perhaps in particular. The war gave impetus in the colonial world to the forces of decolonization, and France was not, this is more clear in hindsight, although there were people at the time who said this, France was not in a position to come back into Indochina with the kind of power and strength that it imagined that it would have. And third reason why World War II really matters here is that it saw the rise of the United States to a position of predominance in world and especially East Asian affairs. Here's a key moment in the research for me. All those of you who are historians, most of you are, many of you who have done archival research, you will know that there are times in the archival work when you're in that basement and looking at all those dusty files that you come across a pattern or you see something in the materials that you think, yes, this matters. This was such an instance for me. What I saw in French archives, in British archives, American, to some extent when they were reporting what was going on in other countries, Canadian archives, among others, is I saw officials asking the following question time and time again to themselves, to each other, and it was this: what will the Americans do? What will the Americans do? That question took on greater and greater urgency as World War II went on, and as it became clear that when the fighting stopped, the Americans were going to be very, very powerful indeed. We sometimes forget just how large the United States loomed at the end of the Pacific War in 1945. At the occasion of Japan's surrender late that summer, which I call, in my book, the open moment, when the future of Indochina was anyone's guess, the United States had an extraordinary political power of a kind that we hadn't seen before, and I would argue we haven't seen since. So my point here is that World War II matters a great deal. We also have to give attention to the French Indochina War that followed World War II. So the fighting lasts in a serious way, if you know the story, between, I think, late 1946, to some extent 45. But in terms of a war, I would say late 1946 to the spring of 1954, when the French suffer a colossal defeat at a remote outpost called Dien Bien Phu. That struggle, which historians often now refer to as the First Indochina War or the First Vietnam War, and that's an important designation. That's at the heart of my narrative in Embers of War, and it tells us a great deal about what's going to happen later. So to this question of why we see a large-scale American war in 1965, we have to look back, at least in part. Here's what we find, and I'm cutting this short for the purpose of this presentation, needless to say. In terms of the American part of the story, we find that to an extraordinary degree, Americans followed in the path laid down by the French. To study these wars in succession and especially if you know something about the American war when you start, is to experience a powerful sense of déjà vu. So, let me give you some examples. The soldierly complaints about the difficulty of telling friend from foe, and about the poor fighting spirit among our, as opposed to their, indigenous troops. The gripes by commanders about the timorous and meddling politicians back home. The solemn warnings against early disengagement, as this would dishonor the soldiers whose lives had already been lost. This is what social psychologists would later call the sunk cost fallacy. The stubborn insistence that premature negotiations should be avoided, all of these refrains, ubiquitous in the United States in 1966, 1967, could be heard also in France, in Paris and Lyon, for example, in 1948 and 49. And always, in both instances, always, there were the promises of imminent success, of corners about to be turned. So that when U.S. Commanding General William Westmoreland, in late 1967, exulted, some of you have heard this phrase, he said, but Westmoreland did in late 67, "We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view," unquote. He was repeating a prediction in remarkably similar language that French commander Henri Navarre had made in May of 1953, a decade and a half earlier. Civilian leaders, meanwhile, in Paris as much as in Washington, boxed themselves in with their constant public affirmations of the conflict's importance and of the certainty of ultimate success. It's remarkable how politicians, how often they do this. They box themselves in by their rhetoric, something we can discuss. To order a halt and to reverse course would be to call into question their own and their country's judgment, to threaten their careers. Don't underestimate the importance of plain old careerism. To undermine their reputations. With each passing year after 1949, the struggle for senior French policymakers became less about the future of Indochina, less about grand geopolitical concerns, and much more about, I would argue, domestic political strategizing, and again, the careerism to which I referred earlier. Daniel Ellsberg, who many of you will be familiar with, Daniel Ellsberg would call it the stalemate machine, this phenomenon that I'm describing. And he was referring to the American War. What I want to suggest to you today is that that machine was fully operational also under the French. Now, for a long time, American officials didn't pay that much attention to the possible links between the French experience in Indochina and America's. What mattered, these American officials said, was that the French are a decadent people, trying vainly to prop up a colonial empire, their army a hidebound, intellectually bankrupt enterprise, whereas Americans, we're the good guys. Militarily invincible, we've selflessly come to help the Vietnamese in their hour of need, and then we're going to go home. We're the possessor of the world's mightiest arsenal. We are untainted by colonialism. And the United States is the champion of freedom, the engine in the global drive to stamp out rapacious communist expansion. And on the human side, again, this is the American official argument. On the human side, the French experience with the cupidity and the fence-sitting of their Vietnamese allies, attentisme in the French expression, that fence-setting would not repeat itself. U.S. officials will themselves to believe, how about that phrase? Because this time the Vietnamese truly had something to fight for. They may not have had it before, but they have it now. This was, I want to suggest to you, mostly self-delusion, this argument. For one thing, the French units, I think I show in the book, French units usually fought with bravery and determination and skill. For another, France's war was also America's war. Washington footed much of the bill, supplied most of the weaponry, and pressed Paris leaders to hang tough when their will faltered. It's true. Long before the French War ended, American officials were more committed to the French war than were the French themselves. I think that's unquestionably the case. Furthermore, what U.S. officials for a long time didn't fathom, and then refused to acknowledge after they did, was that colonialism is often in the eye of the beholder. To many Vietnamese after 1954, which is to say after the French defeat, the U.S. was just another big white Western power, as responsible as the French for the suffering of the First War, and now there to impose its will on them, to tell them how to conduct their affairs with guns at the ready. Now there's one American, and this I'm shifting now to the second part of my talk. There's one American, interestingly enough, who I think grasped this dynamic that I'm describing to you about the nature of the French War, about colonialism being in the eye of the beholder. There's one American who grasped this, who understood this dynamic better than any other U.S. official at the time. John F. Kennedy. And this is the second part of my presentation to you. Vietnam is often called Johnson's War, not without reason. Johnson's decisions mattered greatly, as I've already suggested, and I'll talk a little bit more about Johnson. I'm among those who believes that the counterfactual of what a surviving Kennedy would have done in Vietnam had he returned from Dallas alive, I'm one of those who believes that that counterfactual, well, for one thing, it's conducive to good analysis. It's the kind of counterfactual, and we can talk about this, that I think is conducive to counterfactual analysis. But moreover, I think it matters greatly in historical terms. So Johnson is key, no question. But I want to focus on Kennedy for just a few minutes. I submit to you that he's an important figure here. In the interest of full disclosure, I will also say that I'm now working on Kennedy. I'm writing something I've never done before, which is a biography. We'll see how that goes. It turns out that JFK understood this dynamic, as I've said, about the challenges of subduing revolutionary nationalism in this part of the world, about the limits of American military power, again about colonialism being in the eye of the beholder. He understood this dynamic more fully perhaps than anybody else. Franklin Roosevelt, if we go back, I need to mention FDR at least once in this talk. FDR, I think, also had a grasp of this dynamic. FDR understood that colonialism was a dying system, that the United States needed to be on the right side of history. But of course, FDR died in April of 1945. In the later period, Kennedy had, I think, this sense. Already in 1951, when he visited Indochina with his brother Bobby and his sister Patricia, JFK was 34, Bobby was 26. He saw through the French expressions of bravado and optimism, asked penetrating questions about whether France, or by extension any Western power, could overcome Ho Chi Minh's cause. This is 1951. This is a decade before he becomes president. Those doubts, I want to suggest today, never went away, even after he became president a decade later. It's an interesting thing about Kennedy that I think he showed a capacity for nuanced and independent thought in world affairs. He showed an appreciation for the vicissitudes of history, for the limits of American power. But of course, and if you know your Vietnam story, you know what's coming, there's a paradox. And this is something that I'm going to have to sort through in my book that I'm writing. This same Kennedy, who had these doubts, who always resisted sending ground troops to Vietnam, which I think matters, this same Kennedy dramatically increased American involvement during his 1,000 days as president. So that in 1962, the middle years of his abbreviated tenure, vast quantities of the best American weapons, aircraft, armed personnel carriers arrived in South Vietnam, along with thousands of additional military advisors, some of whom were authorized to take part in combat. This is all in 62. By the end of 1962, the number of American military advisors in Vietnam had grown to 11,000. By the time he left for Texas on that fateful trip in November of 63, the number was 16,000. Then under LBJ, the number in 64 increased to 23,000. Congress also in 64 voted to authorize Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, to use military force as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. And then, as I said at the outset of my talk, in early 65, exactly 50 years ago, Johnson sent large-scale ground forces, or began to do so. He started sustained air war, Operation Rolling Thunder, again in early 1965. The U.S. troop count would max out at approximately 550,000. This is early in the Nixon administration. The figure would then begin to decline as Nixon initiated his so-called Vietnamization policy. It had been Americanization in 65. Now it was going to be Vietnamization under Nixon. But at the same time, Nixon continued a massive air war and indeed expanded the struggle, because even as he embarked on this troop withdrawal, he intensified the bombing of North Vietnam and enemy supply depots in neighboring Cambodia, hoping to pound Hanoi into concessions. He also expanded the ground war into both Cambodia and Laos. And so the war continued for 4 years under Richard Nixon, until in late January of 1973, US and North Vietnamese negotiators reached agreement on a deal in the so-called Paris Peace Accords. And that effectively brought the American war to an end. But here's the thing. Here's a troubling conclusion that I've reached in my research over the past couple of decades. None of these three presidents really believed in the war during their administrations. That is to say, all of them, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, doubted the prospects, even with major US ground forces, doubted, again, that the outcome really mattered to American national security. I think that the literature has underplayed this point, ladies and gentlemen. And it also applies, as I hinted at earlier, to key advisors, such as Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, to some extent, and others. It certainly applies to the middle levels of the bureaucracy. In particular, in terms of the existing literature, there's still a prevailing view that officials of the time believed that victory in Vietnam was highly important, believed in the domino theory, in its successor, what we might call a psychological domino theory, which is the so-called credibility imperative. It's not so much that individual countries will fall one by one, as the domino theory held, but that American credibility globally would be shattered if you lost this piece of territory, after insisting time and again how important it was. I think that's still a prevailing view in the literature, that officials, however wrong they might appear in hindsight, believed it at the time. And I want to suggest to you today that it's not really the case. There's not, it turns out, much hubris. There's not much of this exaggerated self-confidence, at least that I can see in the archival record and in the other evidentiary base that we have, at least with respect to prospects on the ground. It is the case, arguably, that there's a certain hubris on the part of American officials about their right, the right of the United States to tell the Vietnamese what to do, the right of the United States to intervene. You could say that there is hubristic thinking, if that's the phrase, on that issue. But in terms of the prospects, I don't see it. In fact, growing pessimism in 1963, Kennedy's last year in office, Kennedy himself grew increasingly wary during the summer and fall of 63. Johnson, for his part, in 1964, began to question the long-term prospects in the struggle, even with major American escalation. He began to wonder about the conflict's ultimate importance to American security. He said in a phone call, and there's lots of quotes we could give, but here's a phone call that he had with McGeorge Bundy in May of '64. And pardon my French, what the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What's it worth to this country? And then, I think it's in the same conversation, he has that quote I gave you before, I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. Like his predecessor, however, Johnson was careful to articulate such sentiments only privately, and then only to a select few. In public, he and his top advisors stuck close to the received wisdom, insisting that the outcome in Southeast Asia was critically important to American interests, that they were committed, they said, to defending their South Saigon ally against what they called external communist aggression. Whatever problems might be hampering the war effort would be overcome in due course, they said, and whatever the price of victory, the cost of defeat would be infinitely greater. The sentiments, sometimes the very rhetoric, echoed that of their Paris counterparts a decade before. And by using such ambiguous language in public, U.S. officials found, U.S. leaders found, again like their French leaders before them, that backing away could be extremely difficult. As I said, you back yourself into a corner and your maneuverability is reduced. Because you know that the hawks, to use the Vietnam era terminology, the hawks stand ready to pounce if you fail to do what you have said time and again that you're going to do. The advisors, meanwhile, were themselves in a bind, having asserted time and time again that success would come if we did X, Y, or Z, and that if we didn't do them, we'd pay a huge price in terms of America's credibility, or French credibility. They were now in a bind because their careers, their reputations were on the line. So they were in a difficult spot. Now, as I've suggested, and here again, I think part of the answer to the question before us is history. I do want to underscore here that Kennedy's and Johnson's freedom of maneuver had been constrained by the choices of their predecessors, by Truman's active support of the French war effort, by the Eisenhower's team's move in 1954 to intervene directly in Vietnam, displacing France as the major external power. By the way, I'll only mention in parentheses here that I do think Eisenhower came closer to intervening militarily to try to save the French position than most historians have suggested. That is to say, the U.S. war in Vietnam might have started a decade before it actually did begin. For more than a dozen years, the United States had committed itself to preserving a non-communist toehold in Vietnam, and both Kennedy and Johnson feared that to alter course now, even under the cover of a fig leaf negotiated settlement, could be harmful, again, in terms of credibility, but not just the country's credibility. We often think of credibility as just a national phenomenon. So it's U.S. credibility, Russian, Chinese. So it's not just national credibility that they're thinking about, it's partisan credibility, the Democratic Party's credibility, and it's their own personal credibility as leaders. So I think you need to have a three-part conception of credibility as we think about these things. Ultimately, Kennedy and Johnson, and later Nixon, found what a long line of French leaders had found before them, that in Vietnam, the path of least immediate resistance, especially in domestic political terms, was to stand firm and hope for the best, to hope that somehow things would turn out fine or at least be handed off to a successor. Keep the patient alive, at least through my term in office, was the operating principle. As Democrats, Kennedy and Johnson felt the need to contend with the ghosts of Joseph McCarthy, Second Red Scare. They had to contend with Republican charges, and the Republicans were very good at this in the Cold War, that they had to contend with Republican charges that they were soft on communism. For Johnson, I think there were also, and I won't have time to talk about it here really, there were also his own insecurities in the realm of foreign affairs that I think matters. There was also in Johnson a leadership style that demanded consensus. That a style I think that was not conducive to wide-ranging discussion of policy alternatives. And also that Johnson had a tendency, we can see, he had a tendency, LBJ, to personalize policy issues. That I don't think, by the way, Kennedy had, referring briefly to the counterfactual. Johnson said early in his administration, some of you know this, in the first week, he said, I will not be the president who lost Vietnam. Now, if you're an advisor and you see this guy who's about 6'4", big towering Texan, saying, I will not be the president who lost Vietnam, that has, I think, a powerful effect. It's hard, at least for me, early in my Kennedy research, it's hard for me to imagine John F. Kennedy saying the same thing. But what I'm saying here is this. The three presidents most closely associated with the conflict in Vietnam escalated and perpetuated a war that they privately doubted was winnable or necessary. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that they sent 58,000 Americans. The latest count that I have is 58,220 Americans to die for a cause that they, the leaders, didn't fully believe in. I think these numbers matter, ladies and gentlemen. In addition to the 58,000, more than 304,000 Americans were wounded in Vietnam, with 153,000 cases serious enough to require hospitalization. 75,000 veterans were left severely disabled. And of course, we must speak as well of the estimated 3 million Vietnamese who perished. 2 million of them civilians. This is for the years when the Americans were heavily involved in the conflict. I think the scale, at least for me, the scale of human misery was so vast that the figures lose a certain meaning for us. Since rounded off figures, 3 million, 2.5 million, 2 million, rounded off figures, which are often no more than educated guesses, convey the horror on a kind of abstract level, while concealing the fates of individual people. But these numbers matter. I'm not suggesting here, by the way, that geopolitical considerations are entirely absent from American policymaking, especially in the early years under Truman and Eisenhower. I do think they worried about the domino theory, or the dominoes falling. And especially after Mao Zedong's forces prevailed in the Chinese Civil War, you can see why in 1949-50 they would be concerned about the geopolitical implications of also losing Indochina. Nor would I deny that a sense of idealism spurred American leaders, a belief that the United States had a commitment to defend the South Vietnamese against outside aggression, a belief that ultimately the American intervention would serve the Vietnamese themselves. There was some of that. But if we construct a causal hierarchy, and I think, as I tell my students, that's the obligation of the historian of decision-making to do. I don't think in that ranked hierarchy, in that ranking of causes, I don't believe that the geopolitical concerns, the idealism, comes near the top in that hierarchy. Instead, I would say that for all of these presidents, in fact, I would say for all 6 of the presidents who dealt with Vietnam, so from Truman all the way to Ford, I think that's 6. The outcome in Vietnam mattered mostly with regard to the damage it could do to their domestic political position. And Johnson perhaps felt this most strongly of all. This, by the way, was also true of the French leaders before them. It will not do, and I'm going to cover this third point very briefly because I'm out of time, more or less. It won't do to stop there. In my third part, I do want to suggest that the circle of responsibility was wide in terms of America's war. It was not just the presidents and their advisors. The escalation of American involvement from the mid-1950s, and certainly in the period we're discussing here, 64 and 65, what I've referred to elsewhere as the long 1964, it occurred within a permissive context. So, for example, the near-unanimous passage in August 1964 of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which again gave Johnson wide latitude. It was a kind of blank check for him. As he said, it's like grandma's nightshirt, it covers everything. That Gulf of Tonkin Resolution should not obscure the fact that it was almost unanimously, in terms of its passage, passed unanimously. It should not obscure the fact that the most respected, most senior Democratic lawmakers on Capitol Hill privately opposed a large-scale increase in the American commitment. William Fulbright, Mike Mansfield, Richard Russell, Hubert Humphrey, who was about to become vice president under Johnson, all of them opposed an expanded war privately. Nor were they alone. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but certainly in the Senate, a clear majority of Democrats and many moderate Republicans were either downright opposed to Americanization or ambivalent. Meanwhile, the vocal proponents of taking the war to North Vietnam, of, escalating the struggle, were strikingly few in number. This is another sort of eureka moment in my research, seeing how few were the actual hawks in 64 and 65. Publicly, however, and this is crucial, the vast majority of these lawmakers voiced staunch support for standing firm in the war, not merely in August 1964, but in the months that followed. It was a tough spot for them to be in, I will acknowledge. 1964 was an election year, for one thing. American advisors in Vietnam were being shot at. Are you really going to vote against the president in that sort of a situation? Johnson, moreover, made clear that he expected party members to fall into line. That was the sort of leader that he was. Then, after March of 65, 50 years ago, a different dynamic took hold. One that, in a sense, we have seen also repeated with respect to Iraq and Afghanistan more recently, which is that you have ground troops on the ground. You have ground troops in place. And so lawmakers face the choice. Do you support the policy, or do you face the political consequences of, quote-unquote, abandoning the troops in the field? As one senator put it, Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, going against Johnson on Vietnam would henceforth be like voting against motherhood. In the press as well, leading newspapers were disinclined to ask tough questions in the months of decision, to probe deeply into administration claims regarding the situation on the ground in South Vietnam and the need to take new military measures. Among the broader public, apathy was the order of the day. Most Americans, like most Frenchmen and French women in the earlier war, most Americans were too preoccupied with their daily lives to give much thought to a small Asian country thousands of miles away. By the way, and I'll only mention it in passing, this is where I see a connection to our own time. This is where I see the Vietnam analogy having special resonance. If you look at the months prior to the 2003 Iraq invasion, you see the same kind of permissive context in operation, in Congress, in the press, and among the general public. I don't think that this permissive context is necessarily immutable. We can debate the impact of the anti-war movement in the Vietnam War era, but there's no doubt to me that it had an effect over time. The anti-war movement put constraints on what Lyndon Johnson in his final months could do in Vietnam in '68, and it limited the military options open to Nixon after January of '69. The anti-war movement did not get everything right. It sometimes romanticized the Viet Cong, the Hanoi government, and it often exaggerated the supposed economic imperatives that lay behind U.S. intervention. But it had an important effect, I want to suggest to you today. Let me close by taking you back, by zeroing in on a particular figure in 1965. And then I hope we can have some discussion. I've tried to suggest today that the mystery of the Vietnam War is ultimately soluble. I've argued that we need to consider the longer history, dating back to World War II and to the French War. I've said that we need to look closely at the American presidents. They matter enormously in this story. And I've suggested that they shared a belief that it was in their short-term political interest. And the short term is the one that always matters most to politicians, as we know, whatever their country. It was in their short-term political interest to stand firm and hope for the best in Vietnam. And third, I've suggested that we need to consider the broader context, this permissive context. By the way, one could add to that permissive context something I didn't mention, which is that key Allied governments opposed or warned against an escalated war, but were not willing to really fight the Americans publicly on the matter. So they too kept their counsel, if you will. But I want to include by having you consider a Frenchman, long since transplanted to the United States, who felt a gripping sense of foreboding as 1965 progressed. His name is Bernard Fall. Over the course of the previous decade, Fall had become America's most respected Indochina expert. He was an expert in what was now being called, and this is telling, the first Indochina War. That phrase was now coming into use in 64 and 65. Fall fully acknowledged that the United States was immensely more powerful than France had ever been, especially from the air. American air power, he said often in the summer and fall of 65, is hugely more impressive and important than the French use of air power. But even as he made this comparison, Bernard Fall doubted that it would make a decisive difference in the end. The unleashing of massive American firepower might make the war, as he put it, militarily unlosable in the short term, but at immense cost, the destruction of Vietnam. He quoted Tacitus, "They have made a desert and called it peace." Even then, Ho Chi Minh's communists would not be vanquished, Bernard Fall argued, for in this conflict, military prowess meant only so much. The war had to be won politically if it was to be won at all. This was the pivotal point about the French analogy, Fall maintained. This was the lesson that must be learned. And yet, he sensed already then, summer, autumn of 1965, few in Washington seemed prepared to learn that lesson. Too few of them saw what Bernard Fall himself saw. And I'll close with this quote. And I actually close my book with this quote. Bernard Fall wrote that Americans were dreaming different dreams than the French, but walking in the same footsteps. Thank you.
Questions, discussion?
Thank you very much for such a great talk. I'm a specialist on China, and I've recently read a book called Japan 1941, which your talk reminds me of enormously. So I'm wondering if you've read it, and if not, whether you've thought yet about extending your idea about the permissive context, which I find very, very interesting and thought-provoking and possibly worth extending elsewhere to other situations, and then finding a way to generalize further about what you found. For instance, on decisions for war in modern times or in Asia or something. In Japan 1941, the author Eri Hota argues that none of the Japanese leaders, the cabinet, the prime minister, the foreign minister, the emperor, who decided collectively to attack Pearl Harbor, thought that it was a good idea, and expected to lose hugely in a conflict with the U.S. But no one person wanted to say, no, let's not do that.
Yeah. Well, I have not read the book. I've heard a lot about the book. And, you know, one's reading list seems to just expand. You know how it is. Yeah. It's on that list, and I hope to get to it before too long.
What about other cases?
But it's interesting to hear you summarize it in that way. And I've heard the same thing, maybe in reference to the book, that the Japanese leaders, as you say, or many Japanese officials, saw exactly what they were getting into. I think you could make this. I do think you could extend this. And one could speak about this in a lot of different contexts, not only in terms of what we might call contemporary history, but you could go back further. And that you often see, and this is true of the Japanese in 41, you're saying, it's certainly true in the case, in the Vietnam case, this kind of gloomy realism on the part of a great many people who nevertheless are not willing to speak to it. What I don't yet know, none of us I think don't know, is that does the gloomy realism also characterize the thinking in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq? This is maybe where we actually have a difference. That on the part of senior officials, at least as far as I can tell, in the Bush administration, we don't have the archives, we don't have the materials yet to really be able to answer this, maybe they had a greater sense of confidence. But it's clear that in Congress, even though Bush got the authorization he wanted by a pretty comfortable margin, in Congress and in the press and on the part of most members of the UN Security Council, the misgivings ran really deep. Do you know what you're getting yourselves into? So I think that one could look at this more broadly, no question. I think that the permissive context notion is a useful one. It has been for me. And somebody, maybe not me, somebody needs to pursue it further.
Another question?
You alluded to this, but I'm wondering if you could talk about the impact of foreign policy.